discussion. Anybody like to start off? You're all unmuted, by the way.
We're all mute. Can I just say, living in the countryside, just picking up that point, and I know there's lots around that and a lot of, it's not as simple as it sounds, but from my experience of moving from the city to the countryside, there is a huge amount of inequality, even more obvious inequality in the countryside than there is than I experienced in the city. And this idea of people coming into a, you know, an already established over generations community, and how they're ostracized for a time and so on. And, you know, I think, you know, I too listened to Thich Nhat Hanh say that, and I just thought it sounds, you know, almost like developing monastic more monastic communities in the countryside, but that wouldn't work either. Not now. I mean, we've moved beyond there technologically and in all sorts of other ways, but the other way of expecting communities to develop in the countryside, I would be, unless they all have that same, you know, worldview and mindset, I think it would be so difficult to achieve that in reality.
I think what Thich Nhat Hanh is talking about is, you know, the model of the community that he's established in France. Yeah. Now, of course, France, you know, every place is different. And one thing about France is that it has a much lower population density than Britain, especially southern France, where he is. So there are large areas of that part of the country that are underpopulated. He's not talking about, you know, somebody living and working in a city, as people do, they're moving out to a village and becoming part of that community. That, I don't think that's what he's referring to. Although there could be some cases where that might be positive. But we know, you know, I mean, usually what you see is like, you know, it's commuter behavior, and you've got an established community there of people whose livelihood has been progressively deteriorating over many years, and they're marginalized and threatened, and prosperous people moving out from the cities, and there's clearly a clash there. I completely you know, agree with what you're saying there. Of course, that's not necessarily going to be a particularly ecologically friendly way of life for those people who are often commuting back into the city in their 4x4s, which they bought, because now we live in the country, we have to have a 4x4. Yeah. So we drive to the city every day in our 4x4. So no, that's not it. That's not it. And when you say monastic, yes, I mean, Plum Village, I've never been to Plum Village. I don't know why I've never been to Plum Village. I'm asking this question. You know, I knew about Thich Nhat Hanh from 1982, and really always had tremendous admiration for him, and only once ever went to any teaching. I can't understand why I didn't get more. I think, you know, possibly unconsciously, the reason why I didn't spend, you know, go many times I had the opportunity to go and hear teachings on retreats and things and go to Plum Village, I never did. And I think possibly unconsciously the reason was because I'd committed myself to the Tibetan tradition, and I think if I went there, you know, my commitment to the Tibetan tradition might be become wobble a bit, because I find it so, you know, such a wonderful example. But anyway, I don't think it's a monastic community. I mean, there are monastics there. There are monks and nuns, but there are also lay people. So it's a mixed community, and I think that's much healthier, you know. And he's very strong, although he's a monk himself, and he advocates, you know, monastic practice very strongly and very, you know, inspiringly. I think he talks about it in that video, and he says, you know, we're not sad and unhappy because we haven't got you know, partners and children, because we treat all the children as our children, and we treat all the members of the community as our brothers and sisters, and we're completely happy and contented. Very easy life being a monk, because everything is laid out. You don't have to worry. You know what time you've got to get up in the morning. It's all easy. It's so lovely the way he talked about it, so relaxed, you know. Oh, it's a very attractive way of life. But of course, not everybody's cut out for monastic life, and you know, we need lay people, because otherwise, if there are no lay people, then the human race would stop. Very clear.
He seemed to think it was more challenging to practice as lay
Yeah.
people,
Yes.
because we have more temptations and more distractions.
Yes.
I actually went on retreat in Plum Village.
Oh, did you? Okay. Oh, yeah. Well.
And it was really, really, really interesting. There was obviously lots of meditations and lots of discussions, but that was the 5 mindfulness trainings. We actually sit down and look at them, and even though different attendants were from different parts of the world, you were put in a Dharma family and you would discuss. And it was really interesting because you'd have people from literally all over on this retreat.
Yes.
A massive mix of community, and discuss, and the wealth of information and the wealth of perspectives and in different ways of interpreting it was actually quite brilliant, because I think everybody came away that bit more an expanded version and more understanding of other perspectives, a bit more flexibility than what they entered the retreat with. That was one of the super duper things about being able to have a look at that mindful training. What does that mean to you? And the fact that, like, when they used to be able to talk with brothers and sisters and involve you in how they would deal if there was a difficulty, and just applying the mindfulness trainings to these things, they're really quite I think they do truly form the actual framework of how these communities can work with all different types of people.
Yeah, totally. Yeah, so, I think that that kind of framework is absolutely necessary, in my view, for the kind of communities that we need if we are going to move towards an ecologically balanced, human society, and indeed towards a society that is kind of humanly balanced and that is, optimal for our flourishing, our well-being, our physical and mental well-being. Those are the rules, that they're taken directly from the Buddha's original teachings, and they're just as relevant now. But I think the way that he expresses them and formulates them is so skillful, and the way that he talks about them. So, I really think this is a great world teacher. This is somebody completely exceptional, even amongst Buddhist teachers. Personally, that's my view. And I think that I looked and I was a bit sad. I mean, it's kind of a bit random, but that video had 12,500 views or something like that, and I thought, everyone in the world needs to see that video. Perhaps I'm getting a little bit over the top fanatical here, but I mean, I've admired this man tremendously for so many years, and yet I'm not, I think now I will be, much more regularly. I've kind of not been in the habit of getting my Dharma teachings from YouTube videos, or from the internet at all. But now that habit is growing on me, and I'm thinking, this is something really, now I've said this many times, it's very significant, very important that now we can get any kind of, all these tremendously, really great, really highly realized spiritual teachers from all over the world on the internet now. But I haven't actually been doing it very much. I watch the occasional video, particularly Eckhart Tolle, actually, because he's another person that, I think he's another of the, another sort of historically pivotally important teacher. The Dalai Lama, Thich Nhat Hanh, Eckhart Tolle, these people will be remembered when in future generations people look back on this period of history and, these were some of the makers of, as people look now back on, Mahatma Gandhi or something like that, he was a tremendously important, pivotal historical figure. These, I think, are going to be some of the people that are looked on in that way. And I think that, we cannot know the future. But we can have an idea. We all have an idea, an image. And if I'll tell you, my image is that, yes, communities like this are the future of human society. We will live in smaller communities that are more self-reliant. They will be more spread out through the countryside rather than being concentrated at incredibly high densities in cities with the countryside being empty. They will be based on spiritual principles, and you know, there will be, you know, there will be people within them, perhaps. I mean, there's an interesting question about the kind of the guru problem, if you like, you know, because our Western worldview is very ambivalent indeed about gurus, isn't it? You know, people are very suspicious, and there are problems. The kind of, you know, the culture of guru worship, and I don't use that phrase disrespectfully, but I think we can acknowledge the truth, the reality. In Tibetan Buddhism, there is guru worship. There's guru worship. You know, the guru is to be seen as an omniscient, you know, perfectly enlightened, totally compassionate being, a divine being. And there's nothing wrong with that. I don't think. I practice it myself, but it's very, you know, it has problems surrounding it. You know, it's Dalai Lama emphasizes it's a teaching that has great dangers. It can be misunderstood. It can be misused. And generally, you know, in our culture, it's rejected for some of those reasons, and also because of the profound commitment and belief in democracy in some form. This is a fundamental part of our modern Western worldview. And the form of democracy that we've got clearly isn't the one that we need. If we're going to have democracy, we need a different kind of democracy. But the question of the role of the teacher in a community like that is a very interesting one. I think some communities will have a leader like that who is a spiritual teacher, like Thich. Some won't. Much more. I think, in general, the model will be more egalitarian, but there still will be people who play that part. You know, who are more experienced and have the gift of spiritual teaching and are recognized as, you know, a good example and so on. I think about going to a community like Findhorn, you know, is another good example. But there are many, many, many such communities. Again, that's a place I've never been to, and I don't understand why. I mean, I knew about Findhorn in the early 1980s as well, and never went. Never been to Findhorn. I nearly went a few years ago because they were having a big conference there, and John and Macy was there, and lots of people like that. And, I must go to this. I never went. About 2012, I think it was. Anyway, the one person that I know well from Findhorn is somebody who is the, and I'm trying to remember his name, but he's the chair, I think, or whatever, of the Global Eco-Village Network. And so this movement of eco-villages, I think, is extremely interesting, intentional communities. And they are continuing to grow, and we have 2 in Leeds, the third one coming. Well, one established for some years, one now building, I think, and another one still looking for a site. And I was actually instrumental in actually starting this off. So this is within a city, and of course I think it's great that they're within cities, but I think also they need to be in countryside as well. It's a very interesting movement, and I think eco-villages and Ecodharma have a good deal to say to each other, so that's something we might look into as well. What is the, you know, we say Dharma community of the future, but it's not. I mean, you know, Dharma is actually it's a universal word. It's not just a Buddhist word, but it comes from. It doesn't come from Buddhism. It comes from Indian spirituality generally, but it's usually associated with Buddhism more, and to some extent with Hinduism, rather than with all forms of spirituality. But I think what we're seeing is, you know, some of those communities are Christian, some of them are Buddhist, Hindu, some of them are nothing. Like Findhorn isn't any of those things, but it's all of those things, you know. So I think the form of spirituality that is coming along with these communities that I I see as being where our social structures are moving towards a much more, balanced and fulfilling and wholesome form of social organization and smaller communities that, of course, they can now, with internet and so on, they can be completely interconnected. So in medieval times, everybody lived in villages, but they had no connection with each other. So this is very different. That there will be, I think, in these small communities. Of course, there'll be bigger ones as well, but rather than, I think probably some of them will still call themselves Christian or Buddhist or whatever for some time to come. But mostly, I think those labels will tend to drop away. And some of the principles of Buddhism and the principles of Christianity and Islam and Hinduism, they will find their way into wherever they're useful, and some kind of new synthesis will emerge, which, because it is kind of fluid and holistic, and because it's global, and because it's all interconnected, it doesn't need to have a name, because it doesn't need to differentiate itself from some other form of spirituality. So like those great religions, they came into being in distinct parts of the world that had their own culture and worldview already, and were not really connected to the others. So, Christianity arose in the Greek or Roman world. Actually, we think of, Palestine, Israel, but they were part of the Greek-Roman civilization, and India, Buddhism, different civilization. There's very little communication between the two for a long time, a little bit more than perhaps people think, but generally Buddhists had no idea that they were Christians, and Christians had no idea that they were Buddhists for about 2,000 years. Whereas now it's all flowing together and mixing together and mingling together. And I don't think that those hard and fast identities of Christianity, Buddhism, and so on, they may continue to exist, but they're not going to be the main manifestations of spirituality. Some people will choose, they won't call themselves. It's happening now on a wide scale. Many people practice Buddhist meditation, don't think of themselves or call themselves Buddhists at all. They say, well, I use this technique, Some people practice Hindu Tantra or Buddhist Tantra or, Sufi meditation or whatever. And I think this is the way things will go. So we cannot separate, I think, we cannot fundamentally, really, ultimately separate ecological activism from spiritual practice and spiritual activism. Spiritual activism is another one. I'm going to stop in a minute because we're running out of time. But I'm sorry, I'm doing a lot of the talking. It's supposed to be a discussion. I'm continuing with my talk. Just one more thing to say. With my Schumacher North organization, we ran a one-year course on spiritual activism, which was created by Alistair McIntosh, a wonderful man, ecological activist and a Quaker, and he taught a master's, MA program in spiritual activism at the University of Strathclyde. And he also did many wonderful things, out there in the Scottish Highlands and Islands, defending the islands from the capitalist villains who were trying to, destroy. With one character who wanted to destroy a mountain to make aggregate for building roads, and that was stopped. Anyway, so there are lots of people like this who are practicing their social, political, ecological, environmental activism absolutely as one with their spiritual practice. And I think, as David Loy was saying, we as spiritual practitioners not only need to get out there, maybe behind the barricades or perhaps a little way off, retreating and chanting prayers to give energy to the people on the barricades, whatever. Not only do we need to be out there and be active politically and in other ways about the environment, but also the environmental activists need spiritual practice to ground them and balance them. Maybe I'll talk a bit more about that next week.
Yeah.
because I think it's a very important area.
One of the things that he actually says as well is that I couldn't listen to his talk, even though I managed it with Thich Nhat, but I couldn't listen to David's for some reason on the internet.
Okay.
But I have got my copy of his
Oh,
book.
very good. Oh, you beat me to it.
I started bits of it, and one of the things he does actually say is that things will only change if we start to think and act differently to what we are doing, and that just doesn't include just ordinary small people everywhere. It will include the governments and political people have got to start thinking differently, a different way of life.
Yeah.
And maybe something like this coronavirus is actually going to bring about that in its way of giving the world a shake-up, really. And one of the things, just to pull out something that you were saying earlier on about the different people and spirituality, I always remind people that Christ wasn't a Christian because there wasn't such thing.
Yeah.
And Buddha wasn't a Buddhist
No.
because they were both just people who were daring to question really what was going on at the time and wanted people to think differently.
Yes.
Which is really what we should be trying to do now.
Yes.
I just feel this, that as I say, whatever it is,
That's right.
and it needs people. It needs us to be doing what we're doing, but it also needs people that are in government to be thinking of different things. And I was wondering about our friend in Leeds who has the MP in Leeds, Fabian Hamilton, that's right. I wondered what his view would be, because he's very supportive of the Tibetan and the Tibetan people and the Tibetan cause, obviously. But I wondered whether he also had leanings to green connection, green leanings and eco connection, because if it was, then it's people like that we should be perhaps trying to get on board with the Ecodharma.
Certainly, Fabian Hamilton will be very receptive indeed. I know that for a fact. I mean, I've talked about it many times. He himself is more prominent as a peace activist. I mean, he's the shadow disarmament minister. He's the only MP who went to the World Disarmament Conference of the United Nations a few years ago, where I think it was 172 nations voted unanimously for nuclear disarmament. None of the nuclear nations were there, but the United, and so of course it can't be ratified by the Security Council, which is entirely the nuclear nations. So you're right, there's a problem with politicians, but actually I don't think we need to worry about the politicians at all. Because the politicians will do what the businessmen tell them.
Well,
it's the businessmen we need to worry about.
It's the businesses, and that's another thing that David Loy does pick up on. He starts his book just with lots of quotes from people.
Yeah.
And one of the things he quotes in there is that some businesses in particular are very powerful in the world.
Yeah.
And that they are out to exploit everything that they can to enable them to survive, and that they should really be rethinking how they're doing things. There are some businesses who are thinking good things and more ecology things, but there's more of them that are not.
I'm not sure about that. I'm really not sure about that, Dee. I think the balance is shifting. The most powerful corporations in the world are no longer the fossil fuel companies. They're no longer the biggest companies. They're no longer the richest companies. The richest companies are the IT companies. And many of them, there's a lot of very green thinking in those companies and in many other companies as well. So I think, actually, if you look into it, there's a surprising amount of really genuine green thinking in big business. Yeah.
Maybe they're going to be part of this shift then. Yeah.
I think that will, because clearly, this particular crisis, the fossil fuel companies are taking a colossal hit. There will be a lot of them going bankrupt. My brother, he rang me up to tell me this bit of news, and he frowned. He was so excited about it. He said, the price of oil in America is now negative.
Yeah.
you have to pay to get rid of your oil.
Yeah.
And the production of oil and coal has dropped. The production of renewable energy has increased. But of course, the IT companies, a lot of, and those are, you know, Silicon Valley, California, there's very, very green thinking. Now, of course, there's contradictions there, you know. Server farms use a tremendous amount of energy. They're trying to convert it to solar. It's not happening quickly enough, but, you know, they're not as green as they would like to be, or as they would like to think. But a lot of them are very serious about green issues. And they are, of course, they're flourishing. Right now, you know, everybody's on Zoom. So it's good. You know, it is shifting things in the right direction, and I think that, you know, there's grounds for hope. But I think what also, coming back to my point about Western science and its linear causality, we tend to think about these questions as, oh, this is where the problem is, this is where the problem is. No, it's a holistic thing, it's an interaction, it's a system. And what's happening with the COVID situation is an incredibly complex interaction between many, many different factors. We won't be able to evaluate it until we come out, but it does look as though on the whole, a lot of those factors are converging in a direction that is positive for the environment.
Well, you know, I thought maybe I was being pessimistic, but when Dee said politicians need to rethink, and I felt I'm not sure the politicians who are in charge, particularly the top politician, I'm not sure that there'll be any rethinking in them. Rather, there will be a shift towards politicians who are already at the other end of the spectrum. And as the people demand, as the activists demand, so will the chemistry of politics change. And that's the only way, I think. Yeah. If you think, I saw both the videos you sent, David, and David Loy said, if you think, Buddha was the original activist.
Yes.
He rebelled. I always thought Buddhism was a rebellion against the Hindu rigidity, which is by then changed from Sanatan Dharma, a way of life, to Hinduism as you know it now, worshipping gods and having rigid caste and creed, and those kind of system became very rigid. And the first thing, his Sangha was, when you enter the Sangha, you lose your caste.
Yes.
You enter the Sangha, you lose your gender. There were women nuns, which in the traditional Hinduism is completely unheard of then. Yes, probably in the last 50 years or so, they have become more acceptable. There were some high women spiritual women.
Yes.
But they had a difficult time being accepted as spiritual person because they were women. And Buddha was the original activist, if you think of it that way. And again, I don't differentiate between Western and Eastern thinking. Rather, I think of materialist and those that are open-minded. So there are many Indians who are far more materialistic in India, leave alone the Indians in the West, than you could ever imagine. So it's a way of thinking, and this is kind of a testing ground, a changing ground between the strictly materialist way of thinking and a more spiritual or right brain thinking. And I'm not sure that sometimes I speculate whether the future is something that unfolds randomly or something that our consciousness make happen. It's the collective consciousness that unfolds the future that it's going to experience. perhaps
there's no such thing as randomness, is it? And that's it. Randomness is purely a measure of our ignorance. It means we don't know the reason. But you know, from a Buddhist perspective, clearly the future is created by mind, yeah, by our mind, of course. Yeah. But not the individual mind. This is the thing. And yeah, David Loy, I think it was a very good point he made, that Buddhism, well, I'm not sure that I want to say exactly that it kind of became corrupted or it lost its essence and became individualistic. I think rather I would say there is an individualistic way to interpret the Buddha's teachings, and there is a non-individualistic way to interpret them. And whilst he's quite right to stress the fact that this isn't about a critique of the Theravada versus the Mahayana traditions, but there is this, you know, dynamic, you know, or this kind of differentiation of different approaches to Buddhism within its history, that some have been more individualistic and tend to view karma as a matter of, you know, I created this cause in my previous life, and now in this life I'm experiencing this, and therefore I need to act in this way and, you know, follow the Noble Eightfold Path, and then I will be freed from my suffering and I will enter nirvana, this individual. But the Dalai Lama calls it the individual liberation vehicle. He says we shouldn't say Hinayana. We should say individual liberation vehicle, pratimokshayana. And then there's the other view, which is the Mahayana view. And again, he says we shouldn't call it that. We should call it not a great vehicle, but we should call it universal vehicle. I forget what the Sanskrit term that he uses. But this is much more based around an understanding of the complete interdependence of everything and everyone, so that you and I are not separate. And so our karma is never anything other than collective karma. So you and I occupy different position within that, you know, constellation of beings and phenomena, that is reality, you know, that is all totally one interdependent thing. And you and I will experience that differently because we occupy different locations within the web of life, within the net of Indra. But karma is not just something that is individual. It is, and this is, I think, David Loy is right to say, this is the form, this is the way of understanding Buddhism that is most useful and important and relevant at the present moment with the relationship to the ecological situation.
Can I say the individual karma, individual moksha, these are concepts that originated in the rigidified Hinduism. They are very much part of the Hinduism that is being practiced, has been practiced for a very long time. Since Buddha's day, that was where it had lost its path.
Sure, anything, you know, I think it may have been at the Buddha's time. It may have been becoming less rigid than it had been. You had the Upanishads and these kind of teachings that were not inspired by Buddha. The Buddha was also an interdependent phenomenon. You know, he was there in what was a great awakening of consciousness within India, and so I think, you know, it's a very complex picture. And sometimes, you know, there are much later forms of Hinduism where you've got this very rigid caste structure. And there were other people like Mahavira, you know, there were other people. It wasn't unique to Buddha, but it's all very complex.
What I was saying was, in Hinduism, there seem to be two separate strands. One is the yogic strand, the thinking strand, which the central concept is the non-dualistic concept.
Yeah.
And then there is the religion, as most people understand.
Yeah. Same with Buddhism. I mean, popular Buddhism is very different from, you know, sophisticated sort of Buddhism of the spiritual elite. Yeah.
These two survived is because of the separation between the mainstream religion and the monastic, if you can call it that, a monastic religion. So it was kept in its pure form in the monasteries, in the ashrams, the way of thinking.
Anyway, this is another debate. I think we don't have time for it at the moment because we need to have some dedication.
I notice a definite morphic resonance between David Loy's Ecodharma and what you are.
Oh, sure.
Initiated.
Yeah. Thank you, everyone. So we'll finish with a few minutes meditation and dedication.